In 2019, a team of archaeologists working in a cave high in the Bolivian Andes pulls a leather pouch out of a sealed rock crevice. The pouch is stitched together from 3 fox snouts sewn into a single container, and it's been sitting untouched for roughly 1,000 years. Inside they find a wooden tablet, a bundle of llama bone tubes, and a collection of small pouches. When they run the residue through a mass spectrometer back in the lab, the results don't make sense at first. This single kit contains traces of cocaine, DMT, harmine, bufotenine, and psilocin. That's 5 different psychoactive compounds drawn from at least 3 plants that don't grow anywhere near each other, carefully combined into one ritual bundle. Somebody 1,000 years ago wasn't just experimenting. They were running what is essentially a pharmacy. And that's not even the oldest evidence we have. Not close. Before we get into how humans found these substances, it's worth a quick detour, because we're not the only species that goes looking for a different state of mind. Reindeer in Siberia hunt down psychoactive mushrooms on purpose. Elephants will walk miles for fermented fruit. Dolphins have been filmed gently chewing on pufferfish to release a small dose of neurotoxin, then floating at the surface in what looks like a trance. Researchers who study this across species think the pull toward intoxication might sit alongside hunger and thirst as a basic biological drive, not a glitch but a feature, which means when early humans found the same plants everyone else was already eating, they weren't inventing something new, they were just the latest species to notice. So how did we actually find these things? Not in a lab, not through trial and error in a controlled setting. Almost certainly through hunger, desperation, and a whole lot of dead ends. Foraging societies tested everything. Roots, bark, seeds, fungi, leaves. Most of it did nothing. Some of it made people sick. And every so often, someone ate the wrong mushroom or chewed the wrong leaf and the world tilted sideways. That moment, confusing and probably terrifying the first time, would have been impossible to forget. And a species that survives by passing down what works would have passed that down too. Which plant? Which part of it? How much? What happens if you eat too much? That's really the whole story of how humans discovered drugs. Not one invention, but thousands of separate discoveries happening independently on every continent by people who had no contact with each other, all converging on the same basic idea. Certain plants can take you somewhere else. Here's what the evidence actually shows once you start looking. In China and Central Asia, chemical traces of burned cannabis show up in wooden incense burners from around 2500 BC, found at burial sites. At one of those sites, sitting right next to the burners, archaeologists found a harp. Picture that. People gathered at a funeral, mourning, playing music, breathing in a mild psychoactive haze while they grieved. That's not a party, that's a ritual, built with intention, by people who had clearly done this before and knew exactly what they were doing. Roughly 1,000 years earlier, on the island of Menorca off the coast of Spain, someone was doing something far more intense. Hair samples pulled from a sealed cave show regular, sustained use of a nightshade cocktail, ephedrine, atropine, and scopolamine. Compounds that don't ease you in gently. Scopolamine alone is known to produce vivid hallucinations, and what people across history have described as out-of-body experiences. The hair shows use over at least a year, which means whoever this was, likely a shaman or ritual specialist, had turned it into something closer to a discipline than a habit. Someone figured out the right dose, the right preparation, and kept doing it on purpose for their community. Across the Atlantic, coca leaves were being chewed in the Andes as far back as 8,000 years ago, and peyote buttons found in Texas have been carbon dated to roughly 4000 BC. In Mesoamerica, stone carvings depicting mushrooms alongside gods suggest psilocybin use was already deeply embedded in religious life at least 2,500 years ago. In every one of these cases, the discovery process looks the same. Someone eats something out of curiosity or hunger, notices the effect, survives it, and tells someone else. Over generations, that trial and error hardens into knowledge, then into ritual, then into religion. And religion is really where this story goes next, because almost none of the early evidence we have is recreational. The cannabis in China was for communicating with the dead. The peyote was for sacred ceremony. The nightshade cocktail in Spain belonged to a ritual specialist who acted as a go-between for the living and whatever came after. Across cultures that never met, never traded, never shared a word of language, the same idea kept showing up. Take the substance, cross into an altered state, and on the other side, believe you've touched something real. You can take the purely rational position that this was neurologically induced hallucination that people interpreted as spiritual contact, and that's a completely fair reading. But it leaves a question sitting on the table. How did civilizations with zero contact independently land on the exact same method for reaching the divine? Some researchers now argue that psychedelics might not just be connected to early religion. They might be where the entire concept came from. The first time a person came back from an experience like that and said, with complete conviction, there is another world, might be the actual origin point of the sacred. Alcohol tells a slightly different version of the same story, because this one seems to have come from accident rather than deliberate searching. Fruit left too long ferments on its own. Grain left wet in a container ferments on its own. Someone at some point drank the liquid anyway rather than throw it out and found out what happens. Chemical residue from a site in China called Jiaohu shows humans fermenting rice, honey and fruit roughly 9,000 years ago, before writing, before cities, before most of what we associate with civilization. At Rakafet Cave in Israel, evidence of brewing goes back 13,000 years, made by hunter-gatherers who hadn't even settled into permanent villages yet. They were nomadic people, brewing beer in caves, which means the discovery of alcohol may actually predate agriculture. Some archaeologists have gone as far as arguing that the grinding generations-long process of domesticating grain wasn't just about food. It might have been driven, at least partly, by wanting a reliable beer supply. None of this looked like what we picture today. Casual, private, recreational drug use is a genuinely recent invention. For thousands of years, these substances were sacred, tightly controlled, and often restricted to specialists. In Mesopotamia, the Sumerians were cultivating opium poppies by 3400 BC and called it hulgul, the joy plant. In Egypt, the blue lotus flower shows up obsessively across thousands of years of temple art, likely soaked in wine to draw out its mild psychoactive properties. And then there's Eleusis. For nearly 2,000 years, thousands of Greeks made an annual pilgrimage to drink a substance called the kykeon as part of a sacred ceremony. Revealing what happened during the ritual wasn't punished with a fine. It was punished with death. And yet the list of known initiates includes Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Sophocles, the sharpest minds of the ancient world, showing up voluntarily to alter their consciousness in the pursuit of understanding existence itself. In 2020, residue analysis on a drinking vessel from a related Greek site in Spain turned up ergot, a fungus that produces chemical precursors to LSD. That's not speculation. That's a chemical signature from an actual cup. The people doing all of this had brains built exactly like ours. What they built around these substances wasn't primitive superstition. It was accumulated generational knowledge about consciousness itself, tested through centuries of trial and error, refined long before anyone had a word for pharmacology. And that knowledge is having a strange kind of comeback right now. Clinical trials are showing psilocybin can produce lasting relief for treatment-resistant depression. MDMA-assisted therapy is showing real results for PTSD. We spent centuries dismissing all of this as superstition, and now we're spending billions of research dollars carefully rediscovering conclusions a Bronze Age shaman on a Spanish island had already worked out with a handful of nightshade plants and a lot of trial and error. So how did ancient humans actually discover drugs? Not through one flash of insight, but through thousands of individual moments of hunger, curiosity, and accident. Tested and retested until the knowledge became too valuable to lose. Somewhere in a cave in Bolivia 1,000 years ago, someone packed cocaine, DMT, and 3 other compounds into a fox snout pouch and sealed it away in the rock. They knew exactly what each one did. They knew how to combine them, and they left it there, waiting, without ever imagining that someone would find it 1,000 years later and still not fully understand how they figured it all out in the first place.